Agent Morris with the NSA.
We have identified some very, very interesting anomalous type of aircraft.
Traffic is quite luminous and is exhibiting some non-ballistic motion. Over.
Move very rapidly at any speed or whether any direction it wanted to go. Why it could change and go to the right or the left or go crossways without hesitating a bit.
What do you think it was?
Well, if they call it a flying saucer, that's what it is.
EWA 517, do you want to report a UFO? Over. Negative. We don't want to report.
Look, it wasn't my worst Wednesday night.
Good evening, everybody. This is Smiles Lewis.
Hey, everybody. Mark Jackson. Hey, Smiles.
Hey, man. And this is Anomaly Now, live from Austin, Texas, on this Wednesday, April 26, 2023. And this is the weekly news roundup show of the 501c3 Scientific Anomaly Institute, a.k.a. the Anomaly Archives here in, as I said, Austin, Texas. So we have a number of interesting, strange stories to relate, and I'm going to draw some strange connections that I'm not implying are scientifically based, but we'll see where it goes. Let's just dive right in because it's been kind of a weird few days since the news that we were going to lead with. So folks can go to the website, Anomaly-Archives.org. That's our main website for the Scientific Anomaly Institute. And you can sign up there for our occasional email newsletter, or you can just read it right there, or you can subscribe to the website version. And there's also a link there that will take you to our Flipboard, which is where we aggregate all of the news stories that we share with our audience, our supporters, our patrons. And that is over at flipboard.com /@ Anomaly Archives. And there's a link there that will take you to the longer URL, which will take you to this page that you're seeing now, or that you're hearing now if you're listening to the audio version of this podcast. So this has been a very strange week. Over at a Facebook group that I'm a member of, that's for another wonderful radio show, Radio Misterioso by Greg Bishop. And
this is Greg.
A longtime supporter of everything I've done, including the Anomaly Archives, and good friend, paramaniac Carlos Garza, posted this news link about local Central Texas or Southern Eastern law enforcement publishing on their Facebook page back on April 19th. This notice: Madison County Sheriff's Office, Texas. Madison County Sheriff's Office are investigating the death and mutilation of cattle along Texas-OSR, that's Old San Antonio Radio. Ranchers advised a 6-year-old Longhorn Cross cow had been found lying on her side, deceased and mutilated on their ranch. Trigger warnings for anybody who doesn't like to hear about terrible deaths and mutilations of animals, understandably. A straight, clean cut with apparent precision had been made to remove the hide around the cow's mouth on one side, leaving the meat under the removed hide untouched. The tongue was also completely removed from the body with no blood spill. It was noted there were no signs of struggle, and the grass around the cow was undisturbed. No footprints or tread tracks were noted in the area. Ranchers also reported that no predators or birds would scavenge the remains of the cow, leaving it to decay untouched for several weeks. While looking into the Longhorn Cross's death, 5 other similar occurrences involving 4 adult cows and 1 yearling were reported along the area of Old San Antonio Radio Road running into Brazos County as well as Robertson County. Each incident occurred in different locations, pastures, and herds. The other cows were found in the same condition, lying on one side with the exposed side of their face cut along the jawline and the tongue once again completely removed. On 2 of the 5 cows, a circular cut was made, removing the anus and the external genitalia. The circular cut was made with the same precision as the cuts noted around the jaw lines of each cow. Just like the first, there were no signs of struggle or disturbance in the grass, no blood spill, and no noticeable tracks. No predators or birds would scavenge the remains for several weeks after the death. The cause of death of all 6 cows remains unknown. Multiple similar incidents have been reported across the United States, and we are actively coordinating with other agencies to find answers. Please notify the Madison County Sheriff's Office. Yada, yada, yada. Now, as someone like myself who's been in the UFO scene since childhood, I am not surprised or unfamiliar with connections to the UFO phenomenon of the belief that there are cattle and other animals mutilated sometimes around UFO ways. There is nothing in this initial report or any subsequent reports that I've heard about any mysterious lights. It's just this idea of mysterious carcasses. Now, just proceeding along here, I do want to note some other strange things. Well, first and foremost, I just want to say, I as somebody who's followed the UFO scene and the cattle mutilation thing, I was quite familiar with work of Linda Moulton Howe, who of course pioneered this subject, kind of breaking out of her mainstream journalism career into the anomalous world of strange UFO and paranormal type phenomena investigations. And I think she's recognized really as someone who brought legitimacy to these, the subject of cattle mutilations, mystery animal mutilations. Now, wherever she's gone since then, has got people's, you can tell a lot about a person about what they think of her current research, I suppose. But, and I've had the opportunity to have lunch with her a couple of times over the years at a couple of different UFO conferences. And, of course, I was so starstruck, I really didn't ask any hard questions. But, of course, of late, one of the things she's known for is not taking kindly to skeptical, probing questions. But suffice to say that I've been open-minded about the nature of this phenomenon. I've been open to the possibility that this is, like UFOs, a mass misidentification that again, 80 to 95% of reports are in fact just misidentifications of normal animal deaths. But just like with pilots, military or otherwise, and other UFO witnesses and encounterance experiencers, sightings reporters, you kind of take their reports at face value. And in the case of people who, like pilots, are trained and familiar with the environment and the things that they normally encounter and engage with, you think the same of ranchers. And while people may misattribute low intelligence to rural people and ranchers and farmers, obviously this is not the case, and they're gonna know their best business better than people who don't do that. So one would think that they would recognize and be able to distinguish between natural predation and anomalous carcasses. Obviously, things like the Skinwalker Ranch phenomenon or media campaign, however you want to look at it, have brought this kind of back into the fold, into the mainstream mind. But I gotta say, this has been very strange for me because, Texas is obviously a ranching state, a cow state. But and there definitely have been cow. I know historically there's been mutilation cases, but most people, when they think of the modern cattle mutilation phenomenon, they think about the 70s. That was the real heyday for this phenomenon. It's had its occurrences in every decade since then, at least. But I've never seen in nearby news services, news wires, this kind of reportage. And as I was texting Mark the other day, it was on Monday, I was in my car and listening to KUT, local NPR radio station. And lo and behold, what should go across their newswire but a report about mysterious cattle deaths. And they really steered clear, pardon the pun, of mention it. Like, I don't remember if they used the word mutilation. It was just more like mystery deaths. But it was a very, there was no X-Files or Twilight Zone music. And I was like, that's pretty wild. I've certainly never experienced that. And you, of course, made the observation, well, I should go look at the KUT website to see if they've got a related news story, and I find nothing. However, this turned me on to another news story that we're going to get to, and that is, I was going to just show, here is an article from clicktohouston.com, law enforcement investigating deaths, mutilations of cattle in Madison, Robertson, Brazos County, 6 cows found dead, mutilated with no signs of struggle. Interestingly, just to point out here, nowhere on this page do they use the word cults or cults.
Yeah, that's that was the thing in the 70s. It was all attributed to. And real quick, Miles, just remember, I'd sent you that story. It was first aired on Fox News, actually, on Sunday. And so I'd sent you that story on Sunday. And then Monday, by whatever hook or crook, you ended up hearing it on KUT as well. So it was actually Fox. And there's been such a long break in reporting about cattle mutilations. I can't remember the last one, frankly, that made national news or whatnot. So this was a big deal for me, because it was just kind of like, are these journalists Googling cattle mutilations, and then they see these theories of, UFOs and potential, otherworldly medical experiments or whatnot. And then, couple that with this media blitzkrieg with just UFOs, the Congress hearings, that they decided to bring this back up. I mean, have these been happening, being reported, but not being reported by said ranchers or cattle owners, but not being reported to the public via journalism? And was it just like the timing was just right? So for me, it's interesting. Has there really been a gap, or is this just a reporting or journalism resurgence in terms of the stories themselves?
And I think you're spot on. And that's one of the keys here is the media, the media's coverages of this. How is it happening? We should pay close attention to that, and how it's unfolding, and the probability that, if it bleeds, it leads. Even if there isn't any signs of blood around the bodies, as they say. I just wanted to point out this other article from national coverage, usatoday.com. They do mention at a time, Colby Marshall, vice president of the Sylvies Valley Ranch that had owned the 5 bulls in Seneca, Oregon, referring to cases that you and I were talking about from Oregon back in, I believe, 2019, or maybe it was 2021. Told the AP, Associated Press, that they believe the crimes were, quote, perpetrated by some sort of cult, unquote. So yes, and these are not the only places where I've heard reference to that, and I'm going to bring that back around in a little bit. But lo and behold, what should I discover when I go over to the KUT website? Not anything about these mystery deaths, but
this was a thing.
What? How did I? So, okay, the news reports about, I'm not sure, obviously we don't know what dates these bodies were reported by in the mystery deaths cases, but the news reports really came out, I believe, April 19th, a date that lives in infamy for a lot of people. But what do I find on the KUT website? But more than 18,000 cows are dead after dairy farm explosion in Texas Panhandle, with this
couple weeks ago, right?
Yeah. So this isn't the first report. I think it was on April 11th, but this report on KUT was from April 13th. And of course, the first thought that crosses my mind is, how the hell have I not heard about the death of 18,000 cattle?
Yeah.
In a very strange way.
Was mad.
And I mean, I know that obviously this was covered, and it didn't cross my media threshold, but this really surprised me. And again, happening within a week, more or less, of this the reports from the local law enforcement. Here's another. This is from kcbd.com, and this is from, I believe, the day this happened, April 11th. And in fact, I think I was going to play just a little bit of this.
The fire from this explosion spread throughout the dairy building to a pen where dairy cows were being held. An unknown number of dairy cattle were destroyed by the smoke and the fire. We spoke to Castro County Sheriff, who told us what the initial investigation contributes this explosion to.
The speculation is that it was probably what they call a honey badger, and that is what sucked. It's like a vacuum that sucks the manure and water out, and it's possibly that it got overheated, and probably the methane and things like that might have been ignited and then spread out with an explosion in the fire.
Were we just talking about honey badgers just the other day? I know, totally different thing. This is a device. Sorry to be silly.
Yeah, but methane, highly flammable, combustible biogas generated by the waste of cows, and they capture that. A lot of dairy farms capture it, and they turn it into renewable natural gas, that methane. But yeah, I mean, these large factory farms for these cows produce very high quantities of explosive gases. It's a greenhouse gas, right?
Right.
And the cows have always been attributed to major contributors, leaving commercial airline companies out of it. But, the cows are the enemy of the environment, apparently, because they've never been around. Anyway, yeah, that makes sense, from a process engineering perspective, that system could have very easily been ignited, and with close to 20,000 head of cattle, that's a lot of waste, and that's a lot of methane,
Yeah. And I mean, I have no doubt that this has probably gotten widely re-syndicated and talked about nationally, internationally, probably much the same way. But I'd be curious to see the news propagation cycle reports on how many articles were written about this and how far the readership goes compared to the mystery death.
Right.
Of about a week later. And I'm not drawing any connections, but it does strike me as strangely, creepily symbolic that, I could not have heard about such a horrific way for these cows to die. I'm a meat eater, but this, nobody likes the way most of these animals are kept.
Oh, it's horrific. It's horrific. I'm so glad that, nobody was killed, besides these poor animals. But it just seems strange that then within a week, Texas be a buzz about mystery deaths of 5 or 6, though we've also heard through some other channels that there may be higher numbers of quote-unquote mystery cattle death. I'm going to start just throwing some information out here, and that's really, I am not trying to draw connections. I am not asserting any connections here, but I mentioned the day in history, April 19th. So there's, of course, websites like Britannica.com that'll show you everything that, happened historically on a specific day. And as I say, April 15th, I think it's supposed to maybe Hitler's birthday, and that was some connection to the inspiration for things like Columbine, though it's not the same date. But of course, quote unquote, the worst act of terrorism in U.S. history up to that time, the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995. And 2 years earlier, the 51-day standoff at Waco. Of course, Waco's really been in the news lately because of the anniversary of this, as well as former President Trump's doing his big pre-presidential run conference rally there, and so that just weird, just background for nothing, no connection. I'm not suggesting any connection. But so what else? What other things have happened recently? What other big explosions have happened that might be endangering wildlife? Again, I'm not bringing any of this up for any political reasons. I have my own feelings about the nature of us
exploring space and developing an industry to do so, to get us out there. But some other big explosion happened recently in Texas. This Futurism.com article, debris rains down on protected wildlife after Starship explosion. There's a price to pay. Of course, it's talking about Elon Musk's big rocket exploding and raining debris down. And there are protected wildlife management areas right in the vicinity, and that apparently have been showered with the debris from this rocket.
For prairie fires consuming 60 plus acres. The thing, Miles, about this one, I read the article, and what really stood out to me wasn't so much the ecological damage, even though the article was about that. It was about, the misinformation and the fast tracking of permitting, et cetera, in these areas when they didn't go through the proper channels that a normal person would have to, saying that NASA, Air Force, et cetera, had lobbied very hard against these Texas jurisdictions or whatnot. Anyway, I thought what jumped out at me in the article was that Elon Musk is using a private police / military force to basically, control, the boundary by which his operations take place, and not the local police department. So for me, it jumped out as kind of, here we have this sort of paramilitary police apparatus, not that we don't have enough of that, where now it's sort of insulating, these sort of private endeavors over national sovereignty and over national interests and indigenous people, let alone landowners in the area, et cetera. So who's actually doing the policing is not your elected officials and the people on the payroll, such as the police force that work for you. These are private security companies, and they're allowed to basically roam with impunity, over this property as these things take place. That's kind of what jumped out at me. That's something people need to think about here. As someone that's extremely apprehensive and skeptical about these private security forces, working their way into your quote unquote backyard, which is basically what's happened with these people. The federal, local, state, and local government hasn't decided to step in or do anything. They've they've stood aside, and these military for hires have come into these people's backyard. That's concerning.
Yeah, no, and I haven't read in any detail about these incidents, but I've seen headlines about and heard of stories of, yes, the interaction with locals and local law enforcement and this for hire company. And that, is a very interesting aspect of this.
Because people are protesting this, right? And they have a right to protest. And they don't even have access to public lands, and some these wildlife refuges, are public lands, and they're not allowed to go on them, and because of these private security forces. So, people, you gotta be aware that it's creep, right? It's scope creep. You give them a little bit, they're going to take a little bit more, and we're seeing that happen a lot with the development of some of this larger space endeavors, et cetera. So,
mission creep, yeah. This other colonizing our community, Elon Musk's SpaceX rocket explodes in Texas as feds okay new LNG, liquid natural gas projects. That's over at democracynow.org. Again, not trying to make this a political show, but just pointing out some of these links that I found. And I found this of just interest in the scope of just like, okay, weird explosions happening in Texas within the same time period, and the one that I hadn't heard about that involves cattle. I know I've gone far astray from quote unquote traditional anomalous news here. But in this other one, this is an interesting flashback to September 2021 at theguardian.com. Elon Musk's SpaceX launch site threatens wildlife, Texas environmental groups say. Again, not choosing sides. I tend to feel various feelings about that. But and the other article, we don't seem to learn. 10 years after tragic Texas chemical explosion, risk remains high. And while this is not directly related to methane, I don't think, but Texas has a history of massive chemical explosions. Of course, the I'm gonna forget the oldest one before this one, but 10 years after fertilizer explosion, the impact ripples through one Texas town, and experts warn more work is needed to avert ammonium nitrate disaster. This, of course, relating to the city of West Texas, and this was USA Today. And okay, again, keeping with this weird theme here, huge explosion rips through fireworks warehouse, killing hundreds of animals in lake. Footage shows the immense blast, which resulted in a fire earlier this week. While luckily no one was injured, it resulted in loads of aquatic life dying. Again, this is over in India. It has nothing to do with anything that I'm talking about other than just similar recent examples of wildlife being impacted by human activity explosively. But what does this have to do with anything? I don't know. I've gone very far afield here. So,
well, it's anomalous news. I mean, it is interesting. It's in terms of awareness culture. I mean, this is real stuff. I mean, we have these plants in our backyards. Got to kind of be aware,
Yeah.
Somebody should check their permits, their health and safety plans. Where's the regulators,
Need your honey badger to be in top working order.
That's right. That's right. When was it calibrated?
So going back to the suspicious cattle deaths, I've heard from skeptics for years who say that there is nothing anomalous about these deaths, and that it can all be explained by predators going for the soft areas, and that the quote unquote, laser-like cuts are not anything to do with any exotic technology, that it's just people misidentifying the tears caused by the various types of both mammal and avian, and some have suggested insect predation. British Fortean John Downs, who we had speak here to the Anomaly Archives many years ago, when he was in Texas investigating the Texas blue dogs, the chupacabras, he had, I believe, I forget if he went down to Puerto Rico with Nick Redfern, but they both investigated the classic cases of reports of chupacabra. Very different than the reports here in Texas, which seem to all be like animals with mange, coyotes with mange, that sort of thing. But again, there seems to be like that 1% or 2% of these cases that seem anomalous or seem to have details that don't seem easily dismissible, allegedly. But he was suggesting that there could be insect ant aspects to the some of the reported anomalous aspects of mystery cattle deaths, as far as like the lack of blood and certain organs missing. It's been a long time since I listened to that lecture. We need to get it up and available to our Anomaly Archives patrons, but I keep hearkening back to that again. But so many of the cases, at least the earliest, most anomalous ones, center around like sudden cases. These weren't like, oh, we hadn't seen the cow in a week and then they find it. It's like the cow was alive 5 minutes ago. They go out and it's in this state. They're like, how the heck could this have happened in such a short amount of time?
Well, there's another aspect too, Smiles, and it's the distribution of the cases. A lot of the cases are like 1.5 miles apart from each other across various ranches. It's like a string. It's like a locust swarm, made its way across the landscape and cherry-picked just one cow from this one rancher's land and sucked all the blood out of it, which, you hear these statements in the news where, there was no blood, all the blood was removed. Who's doing that type of examination? I don't know. That's even a medical statement or not, or viable medical statement or whatnot. But, I started looking at distribution of these things. I think actually there was a guy, years ago, I think his name was Kevin Randall. He used to do the Paracast with Gene Steinberg, but he had wrote a book, which was, I think, considered, Brett, you mentioned Molten Howe and her inquiries into this and reporting, but I think Kevin wrote a book about cattle mutilations that was considered kind of the gold standard, to take a Paracast term there, on the phenomena. And he looked heavily at distribution also. And so there's this funny, if you read into the stories that you have there on the Flipboard, and folks, if you want to look into this, Miles has done a great job of posting that, and it'll just lead you from one article to another, and you can run this stuff down. But there is a distribution component where these things are single cows in a herd. It's like they've been picked out. And then they're very close to each other, but across a geographical distance. So that's something, if you're going to think critically about this, you want to keep that in consideration. I'd be curious what folks thought of that. But those are aspects to this that, besides just no blood and, the sex organs were removed and whatnot, start thinking about other aspects of the cases, like, geography and distribution, frequency, timing, blah, 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 and all the other stuff that you kind of have to, that comes into play with some of this stuff.
Yeah.
If you're bringing up insects, okay, did this group of insects go from one farm to 1.5 miles down the road to another farm 2 days later and got this other cow, and they kept marching down the road? It kind of dispels some of these notions of predation when you bring in the temporal and geographic aspects of some of these cases.
There's at least two research. You may be thinking, I'm not sure if it's Kevin Randall. It may be Chris O'Brien. I know Chris O'Brien.
I'm sorry, you're right. Kevin Randall is very. Oh boy, I'm going to get crucified for that.
No.
Oh, Chris O'Brien. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
Kevin came to mind, but you're very right, and I apologize, Chris. It's Chris O'Brien.
Yeah, Chris O'Brien is a longtime cattle mutilation researcher. I believe his titles range from Stalking the Herd. And,
that's the book that I should have referenced.
And I forget he's got a series on the subject, one of which I think has the word trickster in it.
Yes, yeah, very much. He's very high on the trickster thing.
Chris is really good friends with my good friend David Perkins, who is a longtime cattle mutilation researcher, and who during the Streamathon we did a great discussion where we talked about our ideas about the Gaia UFO hypothesis and why he kind of came to that via the cattle mutilation research that he was doing. And one of the things that he mentioned, where I was kind of going with my references to, and you pointing out that so many of these cases end getting blamed on humans, but not necessarily but like cults, and I think that naturally comes up because that's where people's minds go. There is this fear factor that's simple as, a fear of the unknown. What could people be doing with blood and organs? And it sounds like animal sacrifice, and certainly, many religions have connections to such things, and it's easier to imagine humans doing such things than aliens or a government conspiracy. But both David and Chris O'Brien, when they investigated, and continue to investigate, I think they've got a pretty good handle on it, and I tend to trust their judgment after all their decades of research into this field, and so I can dismiss a lot on my own, especially in this case where they're not on the ground researching these particular cases, and it's hard to judge what's going on in this local case. It's just noteworthy that this is happening locally, and it is important for media to, identify speculation versus any evidence of anything. And of course, the classic cases that people like David and Chris have investigated often have those really anomalous elements, like the animal appeared to have been dropped from the air, and the air being pristine except for one scalpel, or all these other things. And I also there's so much information I wanted to throw out here, but I hearken back to the 90s when I was really getting hot and heavy into all this stuff and publishing my zine. And I can't remember if it was Popular Mechanics or Popular Science, but I clipped it out and I have it in our files of the archives somewhere. They were reporting on a new belt-mounted field medic's laser for like cauterizing wounds and doing in the field surgery. And of course, the classic 70s and early 80s classic cattle mutilation mythology was and is now this idea of these perfect cuts that seem cauterized and not something like with a, chopping hide with a serrated blade or something that would leave telltale marks of its own, just like predation would leave telltale marks of a certain type that would seem to be dissimilar than what's described in these anomalous cases. But of course, David Perkins also relates that when he started investigating things, the local law enforcement immediately made him a prime suspect. They thought, oh, these are cultists, and this guy who's investigating these cases, he's probably in on it. But so recently, an acquaintance of mine who is a religious studies professor at a local university in the Central Texas area, he was very skeptical about this stuff. I'm not going to name him, but he had some interesting things to say. The first seemed pretty dismissive, and one of which is that he'd been reached out to by the Daily Mail, not the most reputable news outlet. And his concern is that this is, and rightfully so, is that this could lead to another kind of satanic panic. That if and everybody seeing cultists under every bed sort of thing, with this lack of good subjects to pin this on. But let's see. So he was suggesting this idea that it's vultures, that vultures do all the things that you would that we hear reported in this, that they go for the tongue and the soft tissues and that sort of thing, and they thus wouldn't leave tracks. There would be no human tracks because they're just birds, and that may or may not appear significant or noticeable to the ranchers. But of course, part of these very reports that we just read earlier are that animals and birds especially are not picking at these bodies, allegedly.
And that was your point about these ranchers having enough of their knowledge to know what a vulture predated carcass looks like compared to another one. And I will say I have read an article about certain vultures having diseases in their mouths where they have chemical burns that can cauterize and make these sort of like, make the skin basically, it sort of eats the skin back and creates these sort of clean cuts and whatnot. That's one of the theories that's out there as well. Now, just to get weird for a second, I will say that, and we haven't talked about this for a long time, but I did an investigation in here a few years ago in North Dakota. I was researching people shooting, supposedly, aliens. Okay, and so I came across this case outside of Bismarck, North Dakota, the Evan Breeze case, and actually Linda Moulton-Howe did a big story on this particular case. It was very involved, but I went out there and I was shown by the family a hide that had been marked by what looked like lasers, essentially, and I have photographs of that. Same thing, cattle mutilation, soft tissue removed, sex organs removed, whatnot, but there was just these strange markings on the hide, and the family had kept the markings. Now, the follow-up to the cattle mutilations in that particular story, and what I got into with the family was that, well, the boy that lived on the ranch, he ended up shooting an alien with a .22 who was trying to steal his pigs out of a pig corral. There were 3 of them, actually. And he had noted that what was very weird about it is some of them had hooks for hands by which they were abducting this prized pig. And the other one had razors for hands. And then Linda actually in her research goes into find out other cases. I think Jacques actually went into a few of these cases as well, where abductees go on these craft and they're looking at, essentially meat being cut up or carved by automatons or aliens with basically knives for apparatus or for hands or whatnot. It's very interesting. So one could spur the fantasy of the other or whatnot, but there are these strange cases out there. People want to look into them where, where these entities or beings literally have razor sharp appendages by which they're cutting up meat, apparently. So I just think that's strange, obviously, first of all, but those stories are out there and there's a lot of them. It's interesting.
I think we may have discussed this before on a previous show.
I think a few years ago. Yeah. A couple of years ago, maybe. Yeah.
And there was the weird connection to, I had just watched Witness to Another World, the documentary film about the interviewing the now adult man who had, as a child.
Did they say that?
I think we talked about it because there was something about the entity. I think that one of the entities encountered had some kind of hooks for hand, or there was something really weird that I remember in watching the film. I was like, what? That's really weird. I could be misremembering, but
it's weird to make up something like that. Right?
Yeah.
If you're just going to start making up stuff and you're going through the narrative in your head and you're like, I'm going to throw some hooks in there and I'm going to throw some razor fingers in there and just see how this rides,
So this religious studies acquaintance of mine, he also was mentioning he says, it only takes a few ranchers to turn a routine dead animal into a mystery, which is how we get reports of chupacabras, etc. And he mentions the book Mute Evidence, which I've heard of, and we probably have in the archives, but I haven't read it. But it's a skeptical take from 1984 about mutilation phenomena. And he said, this friend relating that says that book found that big commercial ranchers never reported mutilations. I don't know if that's true or not, but that may be what's presented in the book. Mutilation reports also correlate with economic stress on small ranchers. The whole phenomena began when Nixon raised the price of grain, hurting ranchers. Inflation could be causing a similar situation now. He's being very dismissive here, but I believe goes on to say, bottom line is the media have been seeking out cult experts all week, and that's why he was contacted, because he's an expert on this. I agree it's debatable how much of that is the fault of statements from the police and how much is just the media trying to gin up the story. I am not a scientist and not qualified to make assessments of natural phenomena I've never witnessed firsthand, but I do think I have a duty to make sure this doesn't get blamed on minority religions or lead to a moral panic. I agree, and this is where I was like, oh, good. I agree with that some of the paranormal explanations, to the extent that I don't think this is the work of humans. So there you have it. I'm very curious to look into this book and also to see if those researcher friends of ours, David and Chris, are familiar. I'm sure they read it many years ago and probably threw it across the room, but who knows? But yeah, I do think it's important to not create moral panic. This is a very interesting situation where this has now been reported by, as we say, local law enforcement, and they were inundated apparently by calls to the point where they may or may not have faked losing all their telecommunications.
Oh yes,
the inquiries, and I know that happens where they're just like, somebody unplugged the phone, it's ringing too much, or they were getting too many emails, and it's like a denial of service attack on their servers.
Yes. So should we be expecting more of these cases? How do these waves work from your research or exposure to some of these experts, et cetera? Are they this short-lived and then it crops up a decade later? Or, are people on the lookout? Have authorities now spread the word where they don't want to report on these things? They've kind of hushed ranchers. Maybe this, it came up after a certain amount of time where this first story got out, and now they've, sort of buttoned down the hatches on these ranchers again, said, hey, you can report it to us, but let's keep the news out of it, sort of deal. But, who knows?
Yeah, I think the pattern seems to be, there's a flurry of sighting. It can go for a while, and it can get even more intense, usually if there's sightings of other things in the sky and ranchers going all militia and, camping out with their guns at night. All that stuff's happened, and this is their livelihood, and you would expect them to defend it. But it can also just stop on a dime. But we haven't seen or heard any reports of any of this anomalous aspect particularly. So it'll be curious. It'll be interesting to see how this progresses. A couple of other things I was going to say is I believe David and Chris also, some of the patterns that they had noted was, and I don't think they felt strongly enough that this bore out statistically, but to their eyes, the data suggested that there was a connection to atomic sites, atomic energy and testing and that sort of thing. I believe, I could be mischaracterizing, but I think we touched on that in our discussion, me and David. And I've heard him mention it on other interviews in the last year or two. Also, NIDS, National Institute for Discovery Science, the Bob Bigelow, billionaire Bigelow, they did their Colm Kelleher, the Skinwalker Ranch guy. He did his investigation and they did their investigation, and he published the book on the subject of cattle mutilations and came to the conclusion it was a government project sampling cows of ranchers and trying to look for possibly bovine mad cow wasting disease, whatever, these different things that can affect population herds, so that could have a national security, national disaster, not natural, but a disaster type situation. And finally, I was also just going to throw out one of the things I remember when the most famous law enforcement guy, Gabe Valdez, was investigating the cattle mutilations, and Valet was witness, I think, to this, was where they I forget exactly how this came about, but they discovered that one of the mutilated animals apparently had some kind of powder marking on it that when you shone a black light over it, it would fluoresce. And what they discovered was this appeared to have been found on multiple mutilated cattle, and then they ran their herd through a pen, or what do you call it, a chute, and looking with this light, and they found others that were marked, some of which later ended up being victims of this phenomenon. And the idea being that this would be something that could be seen from the air, or that this would be one way of tracking cattle surreptitiously by said conspiracy or covert op. Nothing ever came of this, but there's a lot of interesting information in the archives of Gabe Valdez and his work on this. But of course,
I want to throw out one last theory on this I came across. It has to do with spontaneous combustion. Spontaneous human combustion, of course, is a phenomena where people have literally, supposedly, burnt down to their legs in a recliner, where their legs and shoes are sitting there, and then their bodies are in place. And this has to do with, they think, alcohol consumption, and this idea of this internal ignition, burning people up from the inside out. Well, let's go back to our cow story about this methane. Cows produce this methane, and so there's also that I've heard that there's this notion of explanation where internal, spontaneous internal combustion has happened on these cows, and the methane is ignited in their 3 or 4 stomachs or whatever they have, and it's kind of burnt them from inside out. And that would explain the sex organs and the anus and the tongue, anywhere that the gas could escape, etc. So there's some pretty exotic explanations for this also. Just throwing that out there.
You're reminding me that I think ball lightning has even been suggested as a culprit for these, but you know who it really is.
Who was it? Who could it possibly be? Was it? Oh, I don't know. Say it.
Sorry, I had to do that.
Until proven otherwise.
Right. All right. Well, we should probably start wrapping up, but I did want to comment briefly on my good friend Bob Rice sent me a link to he sent me a link to an article that was from this magazine, Popular Mechanics, about Lou Elizondo. It's a portrait profile on Lou Elizondo and his pursuit of the truth and his pursuit of disclosure in the realm of UFOs. We'll have the link to this. I'm not sure if it's a legal link or not, but I hope so.
Well, Smiles, I will say before you change what you're showing on the computer here, I read the Lou Elizondo article. It's great, but those of us that have been plugged into this thing for as long as we have, it's nothing new, really. I mean, there's some good stuff about Lou's background in there. Yeah. There's a comfort level, like a warm and fuzzy about, his intentions, etc. I found this How Mars Will Kill Us article in this magazine issue way more fascinating.
Okay.
There was some great stuff in here on this. And the thing is, like you said, it's a download. So if you're going to go read the article about Lou Elizondo, take the time to read this thing about the this Mars stuff and human inhabitation of Mars. It's fascinating and strange, and it ranges from how to shield us from electromagnetic radiation particles on the way there to how they're going to, use dissolution chambers to melt bodies away instead of burying them, and reusing flesh for various, it's just fascinating. So anyway, I was just going to throw that there. Just a great article. You got 2 great articles in one on this one.
Yeah, there's probably other good stuff in there too. Always fun stuff in Popular Mechanics, Popular Science magazines. Like I said, that thing about the Field Medics laser that was in one of those years ago. I haven't had the chance to read that yet, but so glad that my friend brought this to my attention. The article is, I don't have that, but it's got a different title than shown in this headline. But it's a very extensive article, and takes a while to read. But
it's long. That's right.
There's not really, like I said, there's not that much new there.
Yeah, but for those that haven't really dug in, it's a pretty good travel through time. It's a good timeline article also to kind of get you caught up to speed. So yeah, if you're just kind of getting curious about the topic and you want to know who all these names are that you're seeing in the news and at congressional hearings and whatnot, there's continuity across kind of where this thing started. So, it's a good introductory article for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm glad we can offer it through your links, because if folks are curious, you can get, the article's a little long, but compared to how much has happened, water under the bridge, etc., I mean, it's a good way to find a lot of information in one place, like all your articles, Smiles, frankly.
Well, there's more links that we're not going to get to tonight, but I just want to thank Mark for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in or listening later to the podcast. And we'll go ahead and wrap up and say good night here, and we'll see you on the flip side, y'all.
Catch you. Thanks, Miles. See you, everybody.